A wall of high pressure settled over the middle of the country in the last days of June, and by June 28, 2026, it had locked into place. Forecasters call it a heat dome. It works like a lid on a pot, trapping hot air near the ground and letting it build day after day. Under that lid, more than 200 million Americans lived through afternoons in the upper 90s and low hundreds, with the air feeling hotter still. Cities from New York to Washington broke long-standing records. At least 40 people died. If you want to keep this report on while the story unfolds, you are welcome to subscribe. Now the dome is on the move. It has weakened in the east and rebuilt over the west, and that shift is the part worth watching closely. The same heat that felt heavy and humid in the east is sliding into dry, drought-stricken country that is already on fire. Over the next couple of hours, this report follows where the heat began, why it shifted, and what it means as it moves west. The heat did not arrive all at once, it gathered. In the last week of June, a broad zone of high pressure spread across the middle of the country and began to swell. On the weather maps, it showed up as a smooth bulge in the upper air, a ridge that pushed the fast river of wind we call the jet stream far to the north. That left the land underneath wide open to the sun. That ridge is the heart of a heat dome. The name sounds bigger than the machinery behind it. High pressure simply means the air is sinking. As air sinks toward the ground, the weight of the atmosphere above squeezes it, and squeezed air warms. The farther it falls, the warmer it gets. Sinking air also dries out and pushes clouds away, so the sky stays clear and the sun reaches the ground with almost nothing in the way. Then the ground does its part. Bare soil and pavement soak up that sunlight and give the heat back to the air just above them. The warm air would normally rise and drift off, but the dome sits on top like a heavy blanket and holds it in place. So the heat has nowhere to go. It builds through the day, cools only a little at night, and climbs again the next morning from a higher starting point. Give it clear skies and a few days, and the numbers march steadily upward. What made this particular dome matter was its size and its stubbornness. It did not pass through in an afternoon. It parked. At its widest, it covered the eastern two-thirds of the country, and it stayed long enough to turn a hot spell into a serious event. Forecasters at the National Weather Service warned that dangerous record-setting heat would spread across most of the country, and they used a plain scale to say how bad it would feel. They called much of the central and eastern states a major to extreme risk on their heat scale, the level where the heat can hurt people who lack water or a cool place to rest. The reach is the part worth holding on to. More than 200 million people lived somewhere under this dome. That is a large share of everyone in the country, all dealing with the same sinking, overheated air at the same time. When a single weather pattern touches that many lives at once, small problems multiply. A hot afternoon is an inconvenience for one person. The same afternoon, spread across half a continent, strains hospitals, power lines, and roads all together. It helps to picture the shape of it. Imagine a shallow dome of warm air, hundreds of miles across, resting over the country with its centre drifting slowly from west to east. Under the middle, where the air sank hardest, the heat ran hottest. Around the edges, it eased. As the whole thing crept eastward through the week, the worst of the heat moved with it, sliding from the plains toward the Great Lakes and onto the Atlantic coast. None of this was a surprise to the people whose job is to see it coming. A dome this large sends signals days in advance. The upper air begins to rise and warm in a way the forecast models pick up clearly, and the warning goes out while the sky still looks ordinary. That early view is what lets cities open cooling centres and move events before the worst arrived. For most of us, though, the dome announced itself the plain way. The morning started warm instead of cool. The afternoons pushed past comfortable and kept going. The evenings, which usually bring relief, brought only a slightly less heavy version of the same heat. Day after day, the pattern held, and it became clear this was not a passing hot spell but a settled one. That settled quality is the thread to follow. A heat dome is not a storm that hits and leaves. It is a weight that stays, and its danger grows the longer it lingers. To understand how this one built to its peak and where it went next, it helps to go back to the days before it locked in, when the first signs were already showing on the maps, and a warmer than usual ocean was quietly loading the dice. The warning did not begin with the heat. It began with the water. Weeks before the dome settled in, forecasters were watching the Pacific Ocean. In the middle of June, the National Weather Service confirmed that a pattern called El Niño had taken hold. El Niño is a name for a stretch of the tropical Pacific running warmer than normal. That extra warmth sits far from the United States, but it does not stay put. It changes how heat and moisture move through the atmosphere across the whole planet, and it nudges the odds toward hotter, more extreme summers here at home. This one looked strong. Some forecasters raised the chance that it could grow into what they informally call a super El Niño, a version powerful enough to push its fingerprint onto weather worldwide. That did not guarantee any single heat wave. It is better thought of as a loaded setting in the background, one that made a severe summer more likely without saying exactly when or where. When the ridge began to build in late June, it built on top of an atmosphere already primed to run hot. The nearer signs came from the forecast models. These are the giant computer programs that take the current state of the sky and step it forward, hour by hour, to see where it lands. Days ahead of the peak, they showed the same thing again and again. A strong ridge of high pressure would set up over the centre of the country, and the air a mile or so above the ground would climb to levels that only show up in serious heat events. When the different models agree that firmly and that far out, forecasters take it seriously. They translated the signal into plain terms quickly. The government forecasters wrote that widespread temperatures in the 90s and low hundreds, combined with heavy humidity, would push the feels-like numbers toward 105 to 110 degrees across many places. They flagged something else too. The overnight lows would stay high, with little relief after dark. That detail matters more than it sounds, and it comes back later in this story. Private forecasters filled in the local picture. One weather service built a heatwave scale that ranks an event by how hot it gets and how long it lasts, not just by a single peak reading. On that scale, it flagged strong heat waves lining up for New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, and it marked Raleigh, North Carolina, as facing the most severe stretch of the group, because the heat there was set to sit well above the local threshold for days on end. Here is the useful part of all this early work. By the time the heat became obvious to anyone standing outside, the response was already moving. Cities lined up cooling centres, places with air conditioning where anyone can go to escape the heat. Utilities checked their equipment. Event organisers looked hard at outdoor plans. The forecast bought time, and time is the thing that saves lives in a heatwave, because the danger builds slowly enough that early action can meet it. Still, a forecast is only a map of what is likely. The real event has to arrive to be measured. And when this one did, it did not merely reach the warnings. In places, it pushed past them, into territory some cities had not seen in more than a decade. The clearest way to see how far it went is to look at the records. Not the feels-like estimates or the forecasts, but the plain thermometer readings that cities have kept for a century or more. Those numbers tell the story without any need to raise a voice, and in the days that followed, they climbed to marks that had stood since long before most of us were paying attention. On the second day of July, the thermometer in New York City's Central Park reached 100 degrees. That reading is worth pausing on. Central Park had not touched 100 degrees in nearly 14 years. The last time was in the summer of 2012. For a city that size, with records going back generations, a triple-digit reading is a rare event, and this dome delivered one. The same afternoon, Boston also hit 100 degrees, setting a daily record and marking only the 29th time in its long history that the city reached that mark. These are not feels-like numbers. This is the air temperature in the shade, measured the standard way. When a place breaks a record that has stood for years, it means the current event outran not just an average summer, but the hottest days people there had ever logged. That is the difference between hot weather and a historic one, and this dome kept crossing that line. City after city, day after day. The records did not fall in one place. They fell in a wave that moved with the heat. As the dome slid east, the hottest air rolled from the interior toward the coast, and each region set its marks in turn. Early in the stretch, the Midwest took the worst of it, then the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast. The list of broken daily records ran long enough to blur together, so it helps to pick out a few and let them stand for the rest. On the 3rd of July, Atlantic City, New Jersey, reached 105 degrees. Baltimore's Inner Harbor hit 103. Washington reached 102. Farther inland and south, Raleigh, North Carolina, and Nashville, Tennessee both touched 101. Williamsport, Pennsylvania, reached an even 100. Each of those was a daily record, meaning the hottest that date had ever been in that city's history. The next day, the 4th, the heat pressed on and the records kept coming. Washington climbed to 103. Baltimore reached 102, and so did Georgetown, Delaware, and Salisbury, Maryland. Raleigh matched Washington at 103, and on the New Jersey shore, Atlantic City edged up once more to 106 degrees, the single highest reading of the whole event. 106 degrees on the Atlantic coast, in a place cooled by the ocean breeze, is a genuinely unusual number. It is the kind of reading you expect from the desert, not the shore. That it happened there, on a holiday weekend when the beaches are usually the escape from the heat, says a lot about how far this dome pushed the ordinary rules. There is a quieter set of records here too, and they may matter more than the peaks. Some cities did not break their record for the hottest afternoon. They broke their record for the warmest night. In La Crosse, Wisconsin, the low one night fell only to 81 degrees, tying the warmest low that city had logged in records going back to 1872. Far to the northeast in Caribou, Maine, the temperature dropped no lower than 71, tying its warmest low as well, something that had happened only a handful of times since 1939. A warm afternoon record and a warm night record are not the same thing, and the difference is not just trivia. A hot day is hard on the body, but the night is when the body expects to recover. When the night never really cools, that recovery never comes. The heat stacks up inside people and inside buildings with no chance to drain away. That is where the real danger in this event lived. Not only in the blazing afternoons that made the headlines, but in the nights that refused to let go. To see why those warm nights did the quiet damage, it helps to look at what heat actually does to a person, and why darkness usually offers a way out. The most dangerous number in this heat wave was not the afternoon high. It was the overnight low. That runs against instinct. The middle of the day feels like the threat, when the sun is fierce and the pavement burns. But the human body can take a hot afternoon if it gets a break afterward. The break normally comes at night. As the sun goes down, the air cools, the body sheds the heat it built up during the day, and it resets for tomorrow. Sleep in a cooler room is how we recover. A strong heat dome takes that recovery away. Because the warm air is trapped and cannot escape upward, the nights stay warm. In this event, government forecasters had flagged the risk in advance, warning of record-high overnight lows that would bring little or no relief in the dark hours. That warning came true across the region. In many places, the low never dropped below the mid-70s or even the low 80s. To understand why that matters, it helps to know how the body cools itself. Your inside temperature needs to hold steady near 98 degrees. When you heat up, you sweat, and as that sweat evaporates off your skin, it carries heat away. That is the main tool the body has. It works well when the air is dry and cooler than your skin. It works poorly when the air is already hot and thick with moisture, because the sweat has nowhere to go. Now stretch that over several days with no cool night in between. The body starts each day already behind, never fully unloaded from the day before. The strain builds quietly. This is why heat waves that last many days are far more dangerous than a single scorching afternoon. It is the length, not just the peak, that wears people down. The people most at risk are the ones whose bodies handle heat less easily, or who cannot get to a cool place. Older adults top that list. As people age, the body's cooling system gets less responsive, and many older people live alone, sometimes without air conditioning, sometimes reluctant to turn it on because of the cost. Very young children are vulnerable too, along with anyone with heart or breathing conditions, and people who work or exercise outdoors in the worst of it. The warning signs of heat illness are worth knowing, because they can be easy to miss until they turn serious. Heavy sweating, cramps, dizziness, headache, and nausea are the early ones, the body's way of asking to stop and cool down. The dangerous stage is heat stroke, when the body's cooling fails entirely and its inside temperature climbs out of control. The signs there are different and more alarming. Confusion, slurred speech, a stumbling walk, skin that has gone hot and dry, and in the worst cases, a loss of consciousness. The health agencies are blunt about this stage. Heat stroke is a medical emergency, and it can kill or cause lasting harm if help does not come fast. The advice for getting through it is simple and worth repeating, because simple advice is what people actually follow. Drink water before you feel thirsty. Spend the hottest hours in air conditioning if you can, whether at home or at a public cooling centre, a library or a mall. Slow down and skip the hard outdoor work and exercise until the evening cools, if it cools at all. Wear light, loose clothing. And check on the people around you who might be struggling in silence, an older neighbour, a relative living alone, anyone you have not heard from. That last piece, checking on one another, is not a small thing. Many of the people who die in heat waves die alone, indoors, out of sight. A knock on the door can be the difference. In this event, that quiet toll was already climbing, even as the record highs grabbed the attention. To understand the full weight of the heat, it helps to look next at the other half of what made it so hard on the body, the humidity, and the single number forecasters used to capture how dangerous the air really felt. There is a number weather forecasters lean on during a heat wave, and it is not the temperature, it is the heat index. The heat index is the feels-like number. It takes the actual air temperature and folds in the humidity to estimate how hot the air feels to your body. During this event, the government forecasters kept pointing to it, warning that heat index values would climb toward 105 to 110 degrees, and in some places past that. In a few spots, the feels-like readings pushed toward 115. Those numbers ran well above the plain thermometer readings, and the reason comes back to how the body cools itself. Sweating only works if the sweat can evaporate. When the air is dry, evaporation happens fast and the cooling is strong. When the air is already loaded with moisture, the sweat sits on the skin and barely evaporates at all. So the same 95-degree afternoon can feel manageable in a dry climate and dangerous in a humid one. The thermometer reads the same, the body does not. The measure forecasters use for that moisture is the dew point. The dew point is the temperature the air would need to cool to before its water vapour starts to condense. The higher the dew point, the more moisture the air holds. A dew point in the 50s feels comfortable. In the 60s it feels sticky. Once it climbs into the 70s, the air feels heavy and close, and the body's cooling starts to fail. During this heat wave, dew points across the eastern half of the country ran deep into the 70s. That is why the feels-like numbers ran so far above the actual temperatures. It was not only hot, it was hot and wet, the combination that gives the body the least room to cope. In the humid east, this is what set the event apart. The air itself worked against people trying to cool down. That humid quality is worth marking clearly, because it becomes important later. The heat in the east was a wet heat. It came with thick, moisture-heavy air that made every degree harder to bear and, as we saw, kept the nights warm as well. Water vapour holds heat, so humid nights stay warm long after the sun goes down. The moisture that made the days feel worse also robbed the nights of their cooling. There is a comparison that makes this plain. Think of the difference between a hot dry oven and a hot steamy sauna set to the same temperature. The oven is harsh but bearable for a while, because your sweat still works. The sauna, at the very same reading, feels far more punishing, because the moisture shuts your cooling down. The eastern half of the country spent that week in the sauna, not the oven. This is also why the feels-like number is the honest one to watch. A forecast that says 95 degrees can sound routine. The same day at a feels-like 110 is a different animal, and the body responds to the second number, not the first. Forecasters push the heat index to the front for exactly that reason. They want people to plan around how the air will actually treat them. For anyone caught in air like that, the practical steps do not change, but they matter more. The moisture means you cannot count on sweating to save you, so you have to take the load off in other ways, get into air conditioning, or at least into moving air and shade. Drink steadily. Cut the pace. Watch for the early signs of heat illness in yourself and in others, because in humid heat those signs can come on faster than the plain temperature would suggest. Hold on to the idea of the wet heat as this story moves forward, because the dome is about to travel. When it leaves the humid east behind and rebuilds over the dry west, the very same high-pressure pattern will behave in a different way, and the danger will change its shape along with it. But before we follow the dome west, we need to reckon with what that week of trapped heavy air actually cost the people living under it. By the 6th of July, officials had counted about 40 deaths tied to this heat wave. That number is a hard one to state plainly, but it belongs in the story. because it is the truest measure of what the dome did. Behind the records and the maps were people, and for some of them the heat proved too much. The count of 40 was the confirmed total at that point in the event, drawn from reports across the affected states, and such counts often rise later as more cases are reviewed. Heat deaths are frequently undercounted because the heat works through the heart and other conditions rather than leaving an obvious mark. The losses clustered where the heat and the risk overlapped. New Jersey, which took some of the highest readings of the whole event, reported at least 22 deaths during the heat wave. In Pennsylvania, a person died in Bethel Township, one more life among the total. These were spread across the days of worst heat, when the trapped air gave the body no chance to recover overnight. There is a particular kind of heat death that deserves its own plain warning, because it is both common and preventable. Children left in hot cars. By early July, 10 children across the country had died this way during the heat, 4 of them in Florida. A closed car in the sun turns into an oven within minutes, climbing far hotter than the air outside, and a small child's body heats up several times faster than an adult's. The tragedy is almost always a lapse rather than a choice, a change in routine, a quiet child, a distracted moment. The prevention is simple to say and worth saying often. Never leave a child in a parked car, not even for a minute, not even with the windows cracked. Make a habit of checking the back seat every time you leave the vehicle. The wider pattern in these deaths follows what we saw about who the heat reaches. Older adults, people living alone, those without working air conditioning, and anyone already ill are the ones the heat takes first. Many die indoors, in homes that held the day's heat and never released it through the warm nights. This is the quiet, private side of a heat wave, the part that does not show up on a weather map, and it is the reason officials push so hard on the same simple message during every event. The message is worth stating once more, clearly, because repetition is how it saves anyone. Use air conditioning if you have it, and go to a public cooling centre if you do not. Drink water steadily, ahead of your thirst. Stay out of the worst afternoon heat, and check on the people who might be struggling out of sight. The older neighbour, the relative alone in a warm apartment, the friend who has gone quiet. A phone call or a knock on the door costs almost nothing and can catch trouble early. It also helps to know when to get real help. If someone shows the signs of heat stroke, the confusion, the slurred speech, the hot skin, the fainting, that is not the moment to wait and see. It is the moment to call for emergency help and to start cooling the person however you can, with shade, with water, with wet cloths, while help is on the way. Fast cooling in those first minutes is what changes the outcome. None of this is meant to frighten, it is meant to steady. A heat wave is one of the more predictable dangers in nature, and it is one of the most survivable when people know what to do and look out for each other. The 40 lives lost are a real weight, and they are also a reminder of why the early warnings and the cooling centres and the neighbourly check-ins matter as much as they do. The heat pressed on the body in these days. It also pressed on the systems that keep daily life running. As tens of millions of air conditioners ran flat out at the same time, the strain moved from people to the power grid, and that strain came close to a limit of its own. At the height of the heat, the demand for electricity climbed toward a record that had stood for 2 decades. The place to see it was a system called PJM interconnection. PJM runs the power grid for a large stretch of the eastern United States, coordinating the flow of electricity to about 67 million people across 13 states and the nation's capital. When a heat dome settles over that whole territory at once, nearly everyone reaches for the air conditioning at the same time, and the demand on the grid surges together. During this event, that surge pushed PJM close to, and by some measures past, its all-time record for power demand. The previous record had been set back in 2006 at a level of 165 gigawatts. A gigawatt is a billion watts, a unit big enough to describe the output of a large power plant. So 165 of them is a staggering amount of electricity flowing at a single moment. To approach that mark is to approach the ceiling of what the system was built to deliver. Part of what pushed demand so high was familiar. Millions of homes and businesses running their cooling hard for days on end through warm nights that never let the machines rest. But part of it was newer. The grid now also feeds a growing number of data centres, the large buildings full of computers that run so much of modern life, and they draw power around the clock regardless of the weather. Their steady, heavy loads sat underneath the heat-driven surge and lifted the whole total higher. Faced with demand near the record, the federal government took an unusual step. The Department of Energy ordered electricity generators across the region to run at full capacity, including backup units that normally sit idle and are only brought online in emergencies. The purpose was straightforward: keep every possible source of power feeding the grid so that supply could stay ahead of demand, and the system would not be forced into blackouts to protect itself. It is worth explaining why a grid can fail in heat, even when the power plants are working fine. Electricity has to be produced at almost the same instant it is used. There is very little way to store it at scale, so the supply and the demand have to stay in balance minute by minute. If demand climbs toward the limit of what can be produced and delivered, grid operators have to shed some load, cutting power to some areas on purpose to keep the whole system from destabilizing. The order to run everything at full capacity was meant to widen the gap between what people needed and what the grid could give, and so avoid that choice. Even with those measures, the heat took its bite out of the power supply in places. In New York City, more than 17,000 customers lost electricity during the worst of the heat, as the strain on local equipment did what strain does. Losing power in a heat wave is its own danger, because it takes away the air conditioning exactly when people need it most, and it does so in the homes least able to cope. A blackout on a mild day is an inconvenience. A blackout under a heat dome can turn an apartment into a hazard. This is the hidden fragility a heatwave exposes. The grid works quietly in the background almost all the time, and we rarely think about it. Then a dome parks overhead. Everyone leans on it at once, and the margin between comfort and failure narrows to a sliver. That the system mostly held through days near its record is a credit to the planning that went into it. That it came so close is a reminder of how thin the margin can get. The power grid was not the only piece of infrastructure the heat tested. Steel and concrete respond to extreme heat too, in ways that can slow a train or split a road. As the dome bore down, the strain spread from the wires to the rails and the pavement, and the ordinary business of getting from place to place got harder. On the 2nd of July, near Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a freeway ramp buckled in the heat and sent cars briefly airborne as they drove over the sudden rise. It was a small, strange scene, and it pointed to a real effect. Extreme heat does not only stress living things, it stresses the built world. Roads, rails, and wires are all made of materials that expand when they warm, and during a heat wave, that expansion can push structures past what they were designed to take. Concrete highways are laid in sections with small gaps between them, so the slabs have room to grow on hot days. When the heat runs high enough for long enough, the slabs can expand more than the gaps allow. With nowhere left to go, they press against each other until something gives, and the pavement can crack or heave upward into a ridge. That is what happened on the ramp near Milwaukee. The road had simply run out of room to grow. The railroads faced their own version of the problem. Steel rails expand in heat as well, and a rail pinned in place by its fastenings can only take so much before it risks bending sideways, a hazard railroaders call a sun kink. To guard against it, rail operators slow their trains down when the track gets very hot, because a slower train is far safer over track that might have shifted. During this event, Amtrak reduced speeds along the Northeast Corridor, the busy passenger line that links Washington, New York, and Boston, and cancelled some trains outright. The regional commuter systems felt it too. In the Philadelphia area and across New Jersey, the transit agencies faced delays and cancellations as the heat slowed their operations. For riders, that meant longer waits on hot platforms and crowded, delayed trains, and added strain layered on top of the heat itself. When the network that moves people slows down, the heat reaches further into daily life than the forecast alone would suggest. There is a plain, physical idea underneath all of this, and it is worth stating simply. Most solid materials expand a little when they heat up and shrink when they cool. On an ordinary day, the change is too small to notice. Across a whole continent-sized structure like a highway or a rail line, on a day far hotter than the design assumed, those tiny changes add up until they force a break or a bend. Engineers plan for a range of temperatures, but a historic heat dome can push past the top of that range. None of these failures were disasters on their own. A buckled ramp, a slowed train, a delayed commute. But they add up, and they land on top of everything else the heat is doing. The same day a family is trying to keep an elderly relative cool and watching the power flicker. The trains are late and a highway is closed for repair. The heat does not arrive as a single problem. It arrives as many problems at once, all pulling at the systems that hold ordinary life together. That is the real lesson of the roads and rails. A heat dome is not only a health event, it is a stress test for the physical country, the pavement and steel and wire we move across and depend on without thinking. Most of it held, some of it bent, and all of it needed extra care and repair in the days that followed. Then, after nearly a week of this steady building pressure, the pattern finally broke. It did not fade away quietly. It broke the way a heavy, humid pattern often does, with a line of powerful storms, and those storms brought their own trouble even as they swept the worst of the heat away. The heat did not simply drain away. It was pushed out, and the pushing came with force. From the 4th through the 6th of July, several rounds of severe thunderstorms rolled across the country and broke the eastern heat dome apart. This is often how a long heatwave ends. The trapped humid air holds an enormous amount of energy, and when a cooler system finally arrives at the edge of the dome, that energy releases all at once in storms that can turn violent. The same moisture that made the days feel so heavy became the fuel for the weather that cleared them. The storms brought relief, but they charged a price for it. Across the affected regions, they knocked out power to more than 1.33 million customers. 4 people died in connection with the storms, so the very system that ended the dangerous heat carried its own dangers, and for many families the end of the heat wave arrived not as a cool breeze, but as a night without power, in the dark, as the storms passed overhead. New Jersey saw a sharp example a day earlier. On the 3rd of July, after another day of record heat, severe thunderstorms swept the state and cut power to about 250,000 customers. Losing electricity right at the tail of the heat is a cruel timing, because the homes are still holding the day's warmth, and now the air conditioning is gone too. The storms also tangled the transit system further, forcing more delays and suspensions on top of the strain the heat had already caused. This pattern was not confined to the United States. The same broad heat dome had reached into eastern Canada, and there the break came even earlier. On the 1st of July, Canada Day, powerful storms swept parts of Ontario and Quebec. They brought flooding, and they left tens of thousands of utility customers without power, about 55,000 at one point across the 2 provinces. The heat and its violent ending crossed the border as easily as the dome itself had. It helps to understand why the ending turned stormy so reliably. A heat dome stores energy the way a stretched spring stores force. Hot, moist air near the ground badly wants to rise, but the lid of high pressure holds it down. As long as the lid stays strong, nothing happens. When a weather system finally weakens the lid or shoves it aside, all that pent-up air surges upward at once. Rising moist air is exactly what builds thunderstorms, and air this hot and humid builds big ones. The strength of the storms is a measure of how much energy the dome had been holding back. So the storms were not a separate event. They were the dome's own energy, let loose. For days the pattern had been loading that energy in, degree by degree and hour by humid hour. The thunderstorms were the account being settled. That is why the end of a severe heat wave so often looks dramatic, with wind and lightning and downpours rather than a gentle cooling. For the people underneath, the days around that break were a hard stretch. The heat was still dangerous. The storms added wind and flooding and outages, and the two overlapped. But when the storms finished their work, the change was real. The oppressive dome that had gripped the eastern 2/3 of the country loosened its hold. The air behind the storms was cooler and lighter. In the east, the worst was over. The worst was over in the east, that is, because a heat dome of this size does not simply vanish when one region cools. The energy and the pattern that built it do not disappear, they relocate. Even as the storms cleared the eastern sky, the machinery in the upper air was already rearranging itself, setting up to build the dome again somewhere new. To see where it went, and why, we have to look up, to the winding river of wind that steers these patterns across the map. To understand why the dome moved, you have to look at the jet stream. The jet stream is a band of strong wind that flows from west to east, high above the ground, near the altitude where airliners cruise. It marks the boundary between cooler air to the north and warmer air to the south, and it does not run in a straight line. It waves. It bends northward in some places and dips southward in others, and those bends are what steer the big weather patterns along beneath it. Where the jet stream swings far to the north, it leaves room underneath for a ridge of high pressure to build, and that ridge is the heat dome. For the days the dome sat over the east, the jet stream was locked into a shape that held it there. A large northward bend parked over the eastern half of the country, and under that bend the high pressure had space to settle and stay. Patterns like this can lock in place for a week or more, which is exactly why the heat lasted as long as it did. The steering current simply was not moving the ridge along. Then the shape of the jet stream changed. A deep southward dip in the wind swung into the western part of the country from over the Pacific. Forecasters had seen it coming in the models. That dip did two things at once. As it dropped into the west, it undercut the ridge in the east, weakening the high pressure that had held the heat in place and opening the door for the cooler air and the storms that followed. And on its backside, it began to build a fresh ridge of high pressure over the western states. This is the part that surprises people. The heat dome did not weaken because the energy ran out. It weakened in one place because the jet stream shifted, and that very same shift started building it again somewhere else. The pattern behaves a little like a seesaw. Press one end down and the other end rises. As the dip in the wind pushed into the west and lifted the pressure over the east, it set the western end of the seesaw climbing. The mechanics of building the new ridge were the same as before, just over new ground. High pressure means sinking air. Sinking air warms as it is squeezed, dries out, and clears the sky of clouds, and the sun then cooks the surface below. Give the pattern a few days to lock in, and the heat builds day after day, exactly as it had in the east. Nothing about the recipe changed, only the address did. There is one more piece worth naming because it shapes what comes next. As the pattern reorganized, forecasters watched for the North American monsoon, a yearly shift in the summer winds across the southwest that pulls moisture up from the south. It had not fully arrived yet, but its approach was part of the picture the models were painting, and it will matter a great deal once the dome is settled in the west. For now, it is enough to note that the western pattern was not a simple copy of the eastern one. It was setting up over different ground, at a different moment in the season. So the story does not end with the storms in the east. It turns. The same large-scale pattern that baked the eastern two-thirds of the country picked itself up, followed the shift in the high winds, and began to rebuild over the west. The dome was on the move, and its next home would change how it behaved, because the land it was moving toward was nothing like the humid east it left behind. Watching the transition unfold, forecasters described it plainly as a flip, the heat easing in the east and building in the west at nearly the same time. To see what that flip actually meant on the ground, we can follow the handoff step by step, as one half of the country exhaled and the other began to brace. Forecasters had a simple word for what happened next. The heat, they said, would flip from the east to the west. It is a good word for it, because the two changes happened almost together. As the storms cleared the eastern sky and cooler, lighter air moved in, the pressure was already building over the western states. One half of the country began to exhale while the other began to brace. For a few days the map showed both at once, relief spreading across the east and a fresh dome swelling in the west. The eastern side of the handoff brought genuine improvement. Behind the storms, temperatures dropped back toward normal, the humidity eased, and the nights finally cooled enough to let people and buildings shed the heat they had been holding. The dome that had gripped the region shrank back and weakened, and as it did, the pattern grew unsettled, with rounds of thunderstorms moving through the Midwest and Northeast in the following days. After a week under the lid, an ordinary changeable summer sky was its own kind of relief. The western side was the opposite. There, the new ridge of high pressure was strengthening, and the temperatures were climbing to meet it. Forecasters watched the interior west begin to heat up, with readings set to run well above normal for that time of year. The same sinking, drying, clearing pattern that had cooked the east was now setting up over the mountains and deserts of the western states, and the numbers there would ultimately climb even higher. Two smaller signals showed how far the heat's reach extended as the pattern shifted. Heat advisories went up across parts of the desert southwest, where extreme summer heat is normal, but the new dome would push it toward the top of even that range. And advisories reached all the way to Alaska, a place people rarely associate with heat warnings at all. When a heat advisory is issued in Alaska, it is a sign of how unusual and how wide the pattern had become. It is worth being clear about what did and did not change in the flip. What changed was the location, and, as we'll see, the character of the heat. What did not change was the underlying machinery. It was the same jet stream, the same kind of high-pressure ridge, the same physics of sinking air warming as it falls. The dome was not a new event. It was the same event relocated, and the continuity is the point. This was one pattern moving across the country, not a series of separate ones. For people in the West, the days before the heat peaked carried a particular kind of quiet. The start of July had actually run cooler than usual across much of the region, which made the coming heat easy to underestimate. Forecasters flagged that risk directly. When a hot stretch follows a cool one, the contrast can catch people off guard, especially visitors who do not know how sharp the western sun can be at that altitude and in that dry air. The advice was the plain heatwave advice again, made more urgent by the surprise. Hydrate, avoid the midday sun, and take the coming heat seriously even though the last few days had been mild. The handoff, then, was not really an ending and a beginning. It was a single continuous thing seen from two sides. The east got its sky back. The west started counting upward, and the crucial difference, the one that turns this from a repeat into a new chapter, is the ground the dome was settling onto. Because the west was not like the east. It was not green and humid and quick to sweat. It was dry, and in many places it was far more than dry. Months of trouble had already primed the land long before the dome arrived, and that groundwork is what would turn the same heat into a different and more stubborn kind of danger. To understand the risk building in the west, we have to go back past the summer, to a winter that did not deliver what the region needed. The danger building in the west did not start with the heat. It started with a winter that came up short. The west runs on snow. Through the cold months, snow piles up in the mountains and holds there like water kept in a bank. When spring and summer come, that snowpack melts slowly and feeds the rivers, the reservoirs, and the soil through the dry season. A good snowpack is the region's insurance against a hot, rainless summer. This past winter, that insurance came up thin. Many western states saw snowpack at record or near record lows, paired with a winter that ran unusually warm. Then came a heatwave in March, early and out of season, that melted much of the meagre snow that had managed to accumulate. So the region entered summer with its water bank already low and its landscape already drying out. The groundwork for a hard fire season was laid months before the first hot day of July. By the time the dome arrived, much of the west was in drought, and in places the drought had reached its most severe grades. Forecasters described conditions ranging from abnormally dry all the way to extreme and exceptional drought, the highest categories on the scale they use. Those top grades mean the dryness has gone well past a passing shortfall. The soil is parched, the streams are low, and the plants that cover the land have lost much of their moisture. In practical terms, the whole landscape had turned into fuel that was waiting for heat. This is where the dry ground changes the story. In the humid east, the dome's energy went into heating moist air, driving the feels-like numbers up and keeping the nights warm and sticky. In the dry west, there is little moisture for the sun's energy to work on. Instead of going into evaporating water from soil and plants, that energy goes straight into raising the temperature. Dry ground heats faster and hotter than moist ground, so a dome over parched land can push the actual air temperature even higher than it managed in the east. It also feeds on itself. As the heat dries the ground further, there is even less moisture left to soak up the sun's energy, so the ground heats faster still, which dries it more. Forecasters describe this loop plainly. The sinking air makes rain hard to form, the ground dries out, and the atmosphere warms a little more each day. A dome over a wet landscape has a break on it. A dome over a dry one does not. There was already fire on this land when the dome arrived. Well over 400,000 acres had burned across the west by this point in the summer, the bulk of it in Utah. That is the crucial difference from the eastern chapter of this story. The heat was not moving toward an empty green landscape that would merely feel uncomfortable. It was moving toward dry, cured country that was already burning, and it carried with it the two things a fire wants most: high heat and the promise of little rain. So the same pattern that meant sweltering discomfort in the east meant something sharper in the west. Over there, the danger was mainly to the body, to people trying to stay cool and hydrated. Over here, the danger widens. It still threatens people directly through the heat, but it also threatens to take the fires already burning and make them worse, and to help new ones start on ground primed to carry them. That is the terrain the dome was settling onto as this half of the story closed. A drought-stricken west, its water bank drained by a poor winter and an early spring melt, its landscape cured to tinder, and its fire season already underway. The heat that had merely oppressed the east was arriving somewhere it could do a different kind of harm. What that harm looked like, in numbers and in flames, is where this report turns next. The clearest way to see the change is in the desert numbers. As the dome settled over the west, forecasters called for highs in the mid-110s in Phoenix, Arizona, and in Palm Springs, California, and in the low 110s in Las Vegas, Nevada. In the hottest corners of the region, across southwestern Arizona and southeastern California, the readings were expected to climb higher still, into the range of 110 to 118 degrees. The National Weather Service issued extreme heat warnings for millions of people, with afternoon temperatures forecast to approach 118 in some spots. Set those next to the eastern peak, and the difference stands out. The single highest reading in the east was 106 degrees on the New Jersey shore, and it broke records that had stood for years. In the desert southwest, 110 or more is within reach on a hot summer day in an ordinary year. What made this event unusual there was not that the desert got hot. It was how hot, how early, and how far the heat spread beyond the desert into places that do not normally bake. That spread is the part worth watching. The heat did not stay penned in the low deserts where it belongs. It swelled outward and upward, into the higher country and the interior. Forecasters expected Salt Lake City, Utah, to top 100 degrees as early as that Friday, and Pocatello, Idaho, to do the same over the weekend. Denver, Colorado, and other communities across the Rockies and High Plains were set to climb into the 90s. Across much of the interior west, temperatures were running 5 to 10 degrees above the historical average for the date. 5 to 10 degrees above normal may not sound like much, but it is a large jump when it holds across a whole region for days. An afternoon that would normally reach the low 90s reaching instead toward 100 is the difference between a hot summer day and a dangerous one, especially in towns and cities that see triple digits rarely and are not built around them. Many communities were setting new seasonal high temperature records, marks for the hottest reading so far that year, and the heat was pushing those fresh records higher day by day. The coast told the opposite story, and the contrast is worth noting because it shows how a dome concentrates its heat inland. In downtown Los Angeles, highs ran only a few degrees above normal in the 80s. San Francisco stayed within a few degrees of its comfortable 70-degree range, and Seattle sat in the 70s. The ocean along the west coast is cold, and the sea breeze holds the coastal cities down even when the interior bakes. The heat lived inland, over the deserts, the Great Basin, and the mountain valleys, where nothing cool was nearby to temper it. There is a warning folded into these numbers, and forecasters raised it directly. Heat like this is a fairly common feature of midsummer in the interior west, and long-time residents know how to handle it. Visitors often do not. Someone arriving from a milder place can badly underestimate what 110 degrees in dry air under a strong July sun actually does to the body. The dryness can fool people, because the sweat evaporates fast and the skin stays dry, so the danger does not announce itself the way humid heat does. People can move from feeling fine to being in trouble quickly. That is why the plain advice carries extra weight in the desert. Avoid hard activity in the midday and afternoon hours, drink far more water than you think you need, and keep drinking before you feel thirsty. Take breaks in air conditioning wherever you can find it. For anyone hiking or working or spending long stretches outdoors, the margin for error in this kind of heat is thin, and it shrinks fast once the body starts to fall behind. So the desert numbers are not just bigger versions of the eastern ones. They point to a different kind of event. The eastern heat was a wet, heavy heat that punished the body through humidity and warm nights. The western heat was a dry, blazing heat that pushed the actual thermometer higher and reached into places up and down the interior that do not usually see it. Same dome, same physics, a hotter result on the ground. And the dryness that let the temperature climb so high did something else at the same time. It changed what the heat could do beyond the thermometer. To see that, we have to look at why dry heat and wet heat, born from the very same pattern, carry such different dangers. The same dome produced two different kinds of danger, and the difference comes down to water. In the humid east, the air was full of moisture. When the sun's energy poured onto that landscape, much of it went into working on water, evaporating it from wet soil, from plants, from lakes and rivers. Energy spent moving water around is energy not spent raising the temperature. That is part of why the eastern air temperatures, high as they were, did not climb even higher. The moisture acted as a brake, but that same moisture is what made the air feel so oppressive and kept the nights so warm, because water vapour holds heat and blocks the body from cooling. In the dry west, there is little water for the sun's energy to work on. The soil is parched, the plants are cured and brittle, the streams are low. With almost no moisture to evaporate, nearly all of the sun's energy goes straight into heating the ground and the air above it. That is why dry ground under a dome can reach a higher actual temperature than moist ground under the same pattern. The break is gone. This single difference sends the danger down two separate paths. In the wet heat, the threat is mostly to the human body, and it works through humidity and warm nights, wearing people down over days. In the dry heat, the threat to the body is still real, and in some ways sneakier, because the fast evaporating sweat hides how much water a person is losing. But the dry heat opens a second front the wet heat never did. It turns the landscape itself into a hazard. Here is the chain. The dry heat pulls the last of the moisture out of the soil and the plants. Grass, brush and timber that were already low on water after the drought dry out further under the dome, day after day. Cured vegetation like that is fuel. It catches easily and burns hot and fast. So the same pattern that merely made the east uncomfortable was, in the west, actively preparing the ground to burn. It is a genuine feedback loop, and it is worth walking through slowly because it explains so much of what follows. The dome dries the fuel, dry fuel burns more readily, the heat also warms the air to the point where the humidity drops very low, and low humidity lets fires spread faster. Add the gusty winds that often come with a shifting pattern, and you have what fire officials call fire weather, the combination of heat, dryness, and wind that turns a spark into a running fire. There is a comparison that makes the contrast plain. Think of two campfires, one built with green, damp wood, and one built with wood left to dry in the sun. The damp wood hisses and smokes and struggles to catch, because the fire has to boil off the water before it can burn. The dry wood takes the flame at once and burns hot. The eastern landscape was the damp wood. The western landscape, cured by drought and then baked by the dome, was the dry wood, ready to take a flame the instant one appeared. This is why the move west matters so much to the shape of this story. If the dome had simply been a heat event, it would have been dangerous mainly to people, and the advice would have been the same as in the east, only more so. But because it settled over dry, primed country, it became something more. It became a fire event as much as a heat event. The heat and the flames are not two separate stories here. They are the same pattern, working through dry ground instead of wet. So the dryness that pushed the thermometer toward 118 degrees was also loading a second danger. Every degree that dried the land a little further was also readying it to burn a little more easily. And the crucial fact, the one that turns this from a warning about what might happen into a report on what is happening, is that the fires were not a future risk. They were already burning when the dome arrived, and the heat was moving straight toward them. When the dome moved west, it did not move toward empty land. It moved toward fires already burning. The largest of them was in Utah, high in the Tusher Mountains of the state's southwest. The cottonwood fire had grown into the biggest active blaze in the country, spreading across roughly 94,000 acres. Utah's governor, Spencer Cox, warned that it could become the most destructive fire to property in the state's history. That is a striking thing for a governor to say about a fire still burning, and it captures how serious the situation on the ground already was before the extra heat arrived. Utah was not facing one fire alone. The state had seen the bulk of the more than 400,000 acres that had burned across the west so far that summer. The conditions had grown severe enough that the governor issued a state of emergency in response to the escalating wildfires, a step that frees up resources and support to fight them. When a state reaches that point, It means the fires have outgrown the normal response and need everything the state can bring. Arizona had a major fire of its own, and its location made it especially notable. Around the 4th of July, a fire broke out on the north rim of the Grand Canyon and kept burning through the days that followed. It had consumed well over 123,000 acres, and crews struggled to get a handle on it, reaching only about 13% containment even after days of work. Containment is the share of a fire's edge that crews have managed to box in with control lines, so 13% means the great majority of the fire's perimeter was still open and active. Colorado was in the fight too. The state's governor, Jared Polis, declared a disaster emergency in response to a fire there, authorizing the use of the National Guard to help. Fire officials pointed to Colorado as an emerging center of the trouble, driven by high winds and drought, the mix they call extreme fire weather. Across the wider Four Corners region, where Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, the fires were clustering, because that is where the drought was deepest and the land most cured. The scale of the effort behind these fires is easy to overlook from a distance. On a single day earlier in the stretch, 83 new fires were reported across the country. Each one needs people, aircraft, and equipment, and they were all drawing from the same limited pool at the same time. When many large fires burn at once, they compete for the resources needed to fight them, and that competition can leave any single fire with less than it needs. This is the landscape the dome was settling onto, and it is why the timing mattered so much. A heat dome arriving over a quiet green landscape is a heat problem. A heat dome arriving over a landscape already dotted with large, active, undercontained fires is something more serious. The heat does not have to start the fires, they are already lit. What the heat does is make them harder to stop, and the ground around them readier to carry new ones. It is worth being plain about what the heat threatened to do to these existing fires. Higher temperatures dry the fuel ahead of a fire, so the flames find it easier to advance. Lower humidity, which comes with the heat, lets fire spread faster and makes it harder to put out. And the shifting pattern brought gusty winds, which can push a fire in new directions and fan it to greater intensity. Every one of those effects was pointed at fires that were already large and already hard to contain. So the arrival of the Western Dome was not the start of the fire story. It was an accelerant poured onto a fire story already underway. The blazes in Utah, at the Grand Canyon, and in Colorado were burning before the worst heat came, on land dried by months of drought. The dome's job, in effect, was to make a bad fire season worse. To understand exactly how heat does that, it helps to look closely at the link between extreme temperature and the behavior of a fire, because the connection is more direct than it might seem. The link between heat and fire is not a vague one. It is direct, and researchers have measured it. Start with the fuel. Everything that burns in a wildfire, the grass, the brush, the fallen timber, the standing trees, holds some amount of moisture. Moist fuel resists burning, because a fire has to drive off the water before the material will catch. Dry fuel takes the flame readily. Extreme heat pulls moisture out of the fuel, lowering its water content day by day. So a stretch of intense heat leaves the landscape more flammable at the end of it than at the start, even if not a single new fire has begun. Add the effect on the air. As the temperature climbs, the relative humidity, the amount of moisture in the air compared to what it could hold, tends to fall. Low humidity does two things to a fire. It lets the fuel dry further, and it lets the flames spread faster, because there is less moisture in the surrounding air to slow them. Firefighters watch the humidity closely for exactly this reason. A hot afternoon with very low humidity is prime conditions for a fire to run. Then there is the wind, which often comes with a shifting weather pattern. Wind feeds a fire oxygen and pushes it across the landscape, and it can carry embers ahead of the main flames to start new fires further on. Heat, low humidity, and wind together are what fire officials mean when they speak of extreme fire weather. It is the combination, more than any one factor, that turns a manageable fire into a dangerous one. The research puts numbers on this connection, and the numbers are worth stating carefully. A study looking at wildfires in the West from the year 2001 through 2024 found that nearly half of the total area burned happened during a heat wave or in the days right after one. Nearly half. That means heat waves, which make up a small share of the days in any year, accounted for close to half of all the land that burned over more than 2 decades. The same research found that the fires burned faster during heat waves. The area scorched each day was more than 50% larger during a heat wave than on the cooler days before it. So heat does not just make fires more likely, it makes the fires that are already burning grow more quickly, covering more ground in a day than they would under normal temperatures. That is the mechanism, measured directly, behind the worry about the Western Dome arriving over active fires. There is a piece of history that fits the pattern too. When researchers looked at the timing of fires across the West, they found that the 4th of July stands out sharply, with nearly twice as many wildfires recorded on that date as on almost any other day. Some of that is the heat of early July, and some of it is human, the fireworks and celebrations that scatter sparks across dry land. The two causes meet on the same date, which is why that particular holiday has become a focus of fire concern in the West. Put all of this together, and the picture is clear and unforced. The Western Dome brought intense heat to a landscape already in drought. The heat dried the fuel further and dropped the humidity, and the shifting pattern brought wind. Those are precisely the conditions that, by direct measurement, drive the largest and fastest wildfire growth. The fires already burning stood to grow, and the ground around them stood ready to carry new ones. That direct link between heat and fire is why officials worried so much about one particular source of new sparks arriving at the worst possible moment. The dome reached its western peak right around the holiday, when people across the country, including across the dry west, set off fireworks. The collision of extreme fire weather and a night of open flame is a problem officials saw coming, and it is worth looking at how they tried to head it off. The heat reached its western peak at the worst possible time for one particular danger. It arrived on the holiday when people set off fireworks. The problem is easy to state. A firework is a small, deliberate fire, launched into the air or set off on the ground, scattering sparks and burning debris as it goes. On a wet lawn in a humid climate, those sparks fizzle out harmlessly. On dry, cured grass and brush in a drought-stricken landscape under extreme heat, a single spark can find fuel and grow. The same study of Western fire timing found that the 4th of July sees nearly twice the wildfires of almost any other day, and fireworks are a large part of the reason. Officials in the West saw the collision coming and moved to reduce it. In Utah, where the drought was deep and the fires were already large, the governor took the unusual step of restricting fireworks across the entire state for the holiday. Fire officials planned to work with individual towns to set aside limited, safer areas where fireworks could still be used under supervision. A statewide restriction on fireworks over the 4th of July is a serious measure, and it reflected how primed the landscape had become. There were already rules in place on much of the country's public land. The federal government prohibits the possession or use of fireworks on lands managed by the Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, and the National Park Service. Those are vast stretches of the West, and the ban exists precisely because so much of that land is dry, remote, and hard to reach quickly if a fire starts. The holiday restrictions in places like Utah added a further layer on top of those standing federal rules. The logic behind all of this is prevention, and prevention is far cheaper than the alternative. A fire that never starts costs nothing to fight. A fire that starts in extreme fire weather, on cured fuel, with wind behind it, can grow beyond control before crews even arrive. Given how stretched the firefighting resources already were, with dozens of large fires burning at once, keeping new fires from starting was not a minor concern. It was a central part of getting through the holiday without adding to the load. The advice to individuals followed the same reasoning. Where fireworks were restricted, the guidance was simply to respect the restriction and enjoy the professional displays instead, which are run by people trained to manage the fire risk. Where personal fireworks were still allowed, the guidance was to use them only on cleared, non-flammable ground, to keep water close at hand, and to soak the spent fireworks thoroughly before throwing them away. Small precautions, but in extreme fire weather, they are the difference between a celebration and a wildfire. It is worth stepping back to see the shape of the problem, because it captures something about the whole event. Here was a natural pattern, the heat dome, arriving over dry land at its most dangerous, meeting a human tradition, the holiday fireworks, that scatters fire across that land on exactly the date the risk peaks. Neither the heat nor the celebration is unusual on its own. It is the overlap that creates the hazard, and the response was to pull those two things apart where possible by restricting the fireworks until the danger passed. That overlap of natural and human fire risk is a fitting way to understand this stretch of the event. The dome supplied the heat and the dryness. The holiday supplied a season's worth of sparks in a single night. Officials could not move the dome, so they moved what they could, the fireworks, to keep the two from meeting. Whether through those restrictions or through the plain luck of timing, the aim was to hold the line against new fires while the existing ones already demanded everything crews had. And what those existing fires demanded was considerable. Even as officials worked to prevent new ignitions, the crews on the ground were stretched across many large fires at once, drawing on a pool of people and equipment that was never meant to cover this many serious blazes at the same time. The strain on the firefighting effort is the next piece of the story, and it shows how a heat dome reaches beyond the weather into the machinery of the response itself. Fighting this many large fires at once put a heavy strain on the people and equipment sent to stop them. The scale of the challenge is easy to state and hard to fully picture. On a single day earlier in the stretch, 83 new fires were reported across the country. Several of those fires were already very large. The Cottonwood Fire in Utah near 94,000 acres, the Grand Canyon North Rim Fire above 123,000. Each large fire needs crews on the ground, aircraft in the air, engines, bulldozers, supply lines, and a command structure to run it all. When many burn at once, they all reach into the same limited supply of these things. That competition for resources is one of the quieter dangers of a busy fire season, and the arrival of the dome sharpened it. Fire agencies coordinate nationally, moving crews and aircraft to wherever the need is greatest. That system works well when the fires are spread out in time. It strains when many serious fires flare up together, because there is only so much to go around. A fire that would normally draw a large response might have to make do with less, simply because other fires are pulling on the same resources at the same moment. This is where the states of emergency come in, and it is worth understanding what they actually do. When Utah's governor issued a state of emergency over the wildfires, and when Colorado's governor declared a disaster emergency, those were not just statements of concern. They are legal steps that unlock resources. They free up state funds. They ease the rules for bringing in help from elsewhere. And in Colorado's case, the declaration authorized the use of the National Guard to support the firefighting effort. When a governor reaches for these tools, it signals that the normal response is no longer enough. The National Guard's role in a fire is worth explaining, because it shows how deep the strain can run. The Guard is a military reserve force, and its members are not primarily wildland firefighters. When they are called in for a fire, they provide support that frees up the trained crews to do the frontline work. They can fly helicopters to drop water, move supplies and people, staff roadblocks and evacuations, and handle the logistics that a large fire generates. Calling on them means the civilian firefighting force alone could not cover everything the situation demanded. There is a human cost inside all of this that the acreage numbers do not show. Wildland firefighting is brutally hard work, done in heat, smoke, and steep terrain, often for long shifts over many days. When the fires multiply and the resources stretch thin, the crews that are there work longer and harder to cover the gap. Extreme heat makes that work more dangerous still, because the firefighters face the same risk of heat illness as anyone else, while doing heavy labour near open flame in protective gear. The dome that fed the fires also punished the people fighting them. The weather ahead offered these crews a small and complicated mercy. Forecasters noted that the winds were expected to stay relatively light through much of the week, which can aid firefighting because gusty wind is what drives a fire to spread fastest and behave most erratically. Lighter winds give crews a better chance to gain ground, but the same forecasters cautioned that the continued heat and dryness would keep the risk of new fires high, and that large fires can generate their own local winds through the way they heat the air around them. So even calmer conditions were only a partial relief. The strain on the firefighting effort is a reminder that a heat dome is never only a weather event. It reaches into the systems built to respond to it. Just as the Eastern Dome strained the power grid and the transit lines, the Western Dome strained the firefighting force, pulling crews and aircraft and guard units to their limits across several states at once. The pattern in the sky translated on the ground into people working past exhaustion to hold back fires on drought-cured land. Those fires produced something that spread far beyond their edges and reached people who never saw a flame: smoke. Under a heat dome, smoke does not simply blow away. The same lid of high pressure that traps the heat also traps the smoke, and that turned the fires into an air quality problem across a wide area. How the dome held the smoke in place, and what that meant for the people breathing it, is where the story turns next. A wildfire's reach extends far beyond its flames, and the thing that carries it is smoke. Smoke is what rises off a fire, a mix of tiny particles and gases produced as vegetation burns. The particles are the main concern for health. They are small enough to be drawn deep into the lungs, and the smallest can pass from the lungs into the bloodstream. Breathing wildfire smoke can irritate the eyes and throat, trigger coughing, and make breathing harder, and it hits some people much harder than others. Normally, smoke from a fire drifts away and thins out as it travels, carried off by the wind and mixed through a deep layer of the atmosphere. A heat dome changes that. The same high pressure that traps the heat near the ground also traps the smoke. The sinking air acts like a lid, holding the smoke down in the lower atmosphere instead of letting it rise and disperse. Forecasters described exactly this effect, warning that the nature of the dome would trap smoke in the region. Trapped smoke does several things at once. It reduces visibility, turning clear air hazy and giving the sky a milky or washed-out look. It can dim the sunlight enough to be noticed, and it degrades the air quality, sometimes to levels that pose a real health danger. When smoke is held in place under a dome day after day, rather than blowing through and clearing, the exposure builds, and the air people breathe stays fouled for an extended stretch. The people most at risk from smoke overlap heavily with those most at risk from the heat itself. People with asthma or other lung conditions, people with heart disease, older adults, young children, and pregnant women all face greater danger from breathing smoke. For someone with a respiratory condition, a smoky day under a dome is a double burden, the heat straining the body while the smoke strains the lungs. The two hazards stack, and they stack on the same vulnerable people. There was a further twist in this event, one that connected the western smoke back to the eastern heat. Even during the eastern chapter of the heat wave, forecasters noted that smoke from the western fires could drift east and spread across the country. That smoke, oddly, had a small cooling effect where it travelled, because it dimmed the incoming sunlight enough to hold daytime highs a few degrees lower than they would otherwise have been. So the fires in the west were faintly touching the temperatures in the east, even as the dome held their smoke thickest over the west itself. The guidance for smoky conditions is straightforward, and it mirrors the guidance for heat in a useful way, because both send people to the same place. Stay indoors when the smoke is heavy with the windows closed. Run air conditioning if you have it, which cools the air and, with a good filter, cleans some of the smoke from it as well. That is a neat overlap. The same air-conditioned indoor space that protects a person from the heat also shelters them from the smoke. A cooling centre serves double duty on a hot, smoky day. For those who have to be outside or who are especially sensitive, a well-fitted mask designed to filter fine particles can help, and limiting hard outdoor activity reduces how much smoke gets pulled deep into the lungs. Checking the local air quality reading, which agencies update regularly during smoke events, tells people when the air has reached a level worth staying in for. As with the heat, the danger is manageable when people know it is there and take the simple steps to limit their exposure. Smoke is a good illustration of how a heat dome multiplies its own effects. The dome brought the heat that dried the land and fed the fires produced the smoke, and the dome then trapped that smoke in place, turning it into a lingering hazard rather than a passing haze. Each part feeds the next. This is why a dome over dry, fire-prone country is so much more than a stretch of hot days. It sets off a chain of linked problems: the heat, the fire, the smoke, each one flowing from the pattern overhead. That pattern, though, was not fixed in place forever. Even as the dome baked the west and trapped the smoke, a seasonal change was gathering to the south, one that would eventually loosen the dome's grip. It is a yearly shift in the winds that the whole region waits for, and its arrival would bring both relief and a new set of hazards. That shift, the North American monsoon, is where the story turns as the dome begins to age. Every year, the southwest waits for a shift in the wind called the monsoon. The word monsoon can be misleading, so it helps to define it plainly. A monsoon is not a storm. It is a seasonal change in the direction of the prevailing winds, one that brings a wetter pattern to a region that has been dry. The North American monsoon arrives in summer across the southwest, when the winds shift to draw moist air up from the south, from over Mexico, and the warm waters below it. That moisture is what allows thunderstorms to build over a region that spends most of the year parched. For the southwest, the monsoon is the main source of summer rain, and in a drought year it is the thing the region most needs. After months of dryness and a punishing dome, the monsoon holds the promise of relief, of rain that can dampen the fuel, raise the humidity, and slow or stop the fires. Forecasters watching this event expected the monsoon to become active toward the middle of the month, as the pattern evolved and the moisture began to push north. The mechanism behind it ties directly to the dome. As the heat dome ages and shifts position, its circulation begins to draw that southern moisture northward around its edge. Forecasters described moisture from Mexico moving into the southwest as the dome slowly moved, increasing the humidity and creating more chances for thunderstorms across Arizona and the neighboring states. So the same pattern that brought the heat also, as it evolved, opened the door for the rain. The dome that caused the problem carried within it the beginning of the solution. That is the hopeful part, and it is real. Eventually, forecasters said, the monsoon should deliver beneficial rainfall to parts of the southwest. Rain on drought-stricken, fire-prone land is exactly what the region needs. It can green up the fuel, ease the fire danger, and break the feedback loop of dry heat drying the ground further. The arrival of the monsoon is, in the long run, the natural end of the kind of extreme heat and fire the dome brought. But the transition into the monsoon is not simple, and this is the part that requires care. Forecasters were direct about it. The change from the dry, hot pattern to the wet monsoon pattern often brings some of the most hazardous weather of the whole season. The rain does not arrive all at once, softly. It comes in stages, and the early stages can be more dangerous than the heat they replace. The monsoon is a relief that has to be survived before it helps. The reason lies in how the first storms behave. When the moisture is still shallow and the air below is very dry and hot, the early thunderstorms can produce very little rain at the ground. What falls often evaporates before it lands, but the storms still produce their other effects, the lightning, the gusty winds, the sudden downdrafts. So the region gets the hazards of a thunderstorm without the benefit of the rain that would usually come with it. That combination, storms without rain, over dry and burning land, is a dangerous one, and it is where the next part of the story lives. It is worth holding the whole shape of this in mind. The dome brought heat and fire. As it aged, it began to pull moisture north, which will eventually bring the rain that ends the fire danger. But the road from the dry heat to the healing rain runs through a stretch of storms that bring their own trouble first. The monsoon is the way out, and the entrance to that way out is hazardous. So the arrival of the monsoon does not simply switch the danger off. It changes the danger from a steady building heat into a more sudden and varied set of hazards, dry lightning, dust, and eventually flooding. Each of those deserves a closer look, because the in-between time, after the worst heat but before the healing rain, is when a region that has already endured so much faces a fresh round of risks. The first of those risks comes from storms that flash and blow but do not yet wet the ground. The most dangerous part of the monsoon may be the beginning before the real rain arrives. The reason is a kind of storm that brings the hazards of a thunderstorm without the benefit of its rain. When the monsoon first stirs, the moisture in the upper air arrives before the lower air has had a chance to become humid. The ground is still bone dry from the drought and the dome, so when a thunderstorm builds, the rain it produces falls into that dry lower air and evaporates before it reaches the ground. Forecasters warned that many of the early storms over the southwest would bring little or no rain, but gusty winds and lightning strikes instead. Lightning that strikes dry, cured land with no rain to dampen it, is one of the most efficient ways to start a wildfire. This is dry lightning, and it is a serious concern precisely because it delivers the spark without the water that would normally follow. Forecasters were blunt about the risk. The dry lightning, they said, could set off scores of new wildfires across a landscape already primed to burn. On ground this dry, under heat this intense, each strike is a potential ignition. The winds that come with these storms make the danger worse in two directions. Where new fires start, the gusty winds fan them and push them to spread quickly. Where large fires are already burning, those same winds drive them harder and can send them in new and unpredictable directions. So the early monsoon storms threaten both to start fires and to worsen the ones already going, a double blow to a firefighting effort already stretched thin. The wind brings a second hazard that has nothing to do with fire, and it is one the southwest knows well: dust. The gusty winds around these dry storms can lift enormous amounts of loose, dry soil off the parched ground, creating large dust storms. In the southwest, these are sometimes called by their Arabic-derived name, haboobs, walls of blowing dust that can rise thousands of feet and roll across the land, dropping visibility to almost nothing in minutes. A dust storm is a real danger, especially on the roads. When a wall of dust sweeps over a highway, drivers can lose sight of the road entirely, and the sudden blindness causes crashes, sometimes involving many vehicles at once. The standard advice for driving into a dust storm is specific and worth knowing. If you can, pull well off the road, turn off your lights so other drivers do not follow your taillights into a stopped car, take your foot off the brake, and wait for it to pass. Better still is to avoid driving when a dust storm is likely. There is also a health cost to the dust, which stacks onto the smoke already in the air. Blowing dust fills the air with fine particles that are hard on the lungs, and it hits the same vulnerable people the heat and smoke already threatened. Those with breathing conditions, the young, the old. In a region moving from a smoky dome into a dusty transition, the air can stay hazardous for an extended stretch. The source is changing even as the danger continues, so the in-between time carries a hard irony. The monsoon is the thing that will eventually bring the rain and end the worst of the fire danger, but its opening act can make the fire danger worse, through dry lightning that starts new fires and wind that spreads them, while adding dust storms that endanger drivers and foul the air. The region has to pass through this hazardous doorway to reach the relief on the other side. The relief does come, though, as the monsoon deepens. Over time, forecasters said, the humidity would rise enough to support more widespread and heavier rain, real rain that reaches the ground and dampens the land. That is the turning point the whole region waits for. But heavy rain falling on drought-hardened ground and freshly burned slopes brings a final hazard of its own, one as sudden and dangerous as the fires it helps to end. When the rain finally arrives in earnest, the risk shifts once more, from too little water to too much. When the rain finally comes in earnest, it brings a danger of its own. Too much water, too fast. It seems backward that rain, the thing the drought-stricken West most needs, could be dangerous. But the way it arrives matters as much as whether it arrives. As the monsoon deepens and the humidity climbs, the storms grow capable of dropping heavy rain in a short time over a small area. Forecasters warned that when these downpours intensify, they can lead to flash flooding and debris flows. The relief and the hazard come in the same cloud. The problem starts with the ground. Land that has been baked dry for months does not soak up water well. Hard, sun-cured soil sheds rain almost like pavement, letting it run off the surface instead of sinking in. So when a heavy downpour hits parched ground, most of the water does not absorb. It runs. It gathers quickly into low spots and channels and rushes downhill, and it can rise from nothing to a dangerous flood in a matter of minutes. That speed is what makes it a flash flood, and the suddenness is what makes it deadly. Burned ground is worse still, and this is where the fires and the floods connect. A wildfire strips away the plants that would normally slow the rain and hold the soil in place, and the intense heat can bake the surface into a hard, water-repellent layer. Rain falling on a recently burned slope runs off even faster and carries the loose, dead soil and ash with it. The result is a debris flow, a fast-moving slurry of water, mud, rock, and burned material that pours down a slope with enough force to destroy what lies in its path. The places most at risk are specific, and they are worth naming plainly so people know them. The greatest danger is in canyons and along dry stream beds, the channels that carry the runoff. In the southwest, a dry stream bed is called an arroyo, a channel that stays empty most of the year and can fill with a wall of water with little warning during a storm. An arroyo can be bone dry and look perfectly safe, then become a deadly torrent within minutes because of rain falling miles away, higher up the watershed, out of sight of anyone standing in the channel below. That last point is the heart of the flash flood danger, and it deserves emphasis. The rain that fills a canyon or an arroyo often falls far upstream, Over a slope or a mountain, the person in the channel cannot even see. The sky overhead may be clear. Then the water arrives, having gathered from a storm well away, and anyone caught in the channel has very little time to escape. This is why the standard warning is so firm. Never camp or park in a dry stream bed, and never try to cross a flooded one, on foot or in a vehicle. The safety advice for flash flooding is simple and unbending. When water is rising, move to higher ground, and do it early rather than waiting to see how bad it gets. Do not drive into water across a road, because it is impossible to judge the depth or whether the road beneath is still there, and it takes surprisingly little moving water to sweep a vehicle away. The phrase officials use captures it well. Turn around, do not drown. Most flash flood deaths happen in vehicles, and most are preventable by simply not entering the water. There is one piece of relief in the monsoon's flood risk, which forecasters noted. During a typical monsoon, the flash flood events tend to be scattered and widely separated in space and time, rather than striking everywhere at once. A given storm hits one area hard while leaving the next valley dry. That does not lessen the danger where a storm lands, but it means the flooding, unlike the dome's heat, does not blanket the whole region at the same moment. It comes in isolated, intense bursts. So the arc of the monsoon runs from one extreme to the other. It begins with dry storms that bring fire and dust, and it deepens into wet storms that bring flooding and debris flows. In between, somewhere is the balance the region needs, enough rain to end the drought and the fires without so much at once that it floods. The land moves from too little water to the risk of too much, and both ends of that swing carry danger. Understanding that full arc, from the dome's heat through the fires to the monsoon's floods, sets up the larger question of why events like this one seem to be arriving with such force. That wider pattern is worth looking at plainly, without alarm and without dismissal. Step back from the details and a larger question comes into view. Why did this event carry so much force? Part of the answer sits in the ocean, in the El Niño pattern that was in place through this summer. As noted early on, El Niño is a warming of the tropical Pacific that shifts weather across the globe and tilts the odds toward hotter, more extreme summers in the United States. This one was strong, with forecasters raising the possibility it could become a super El Niño. El Niño did not create the dome, but it loaded the background conditions, making a severe heat season more likely before the pattern ever set up. Part of the answer sits in the longer warming of the climate. The research on western fires that we looked at earlier came with a plain observation from the scientists who did it. The threat of fire on dates like the 4th of July is likely to worsen as climate change continues to dry out the region. A warmer climate means more of the extreme heat that dries fuel and drives fire growth, and it means drought that runs deeper and longer. The heat and the fire in this event are the kind of thing a warming climate makes more common. It is worth being careful and measured here, because this is a subject where it is easy to overstate in either direction. No single heat wave can be pinned entirely on climate change, and heat domes have always formed. The jet stream has always waved, high pressure has always built, and the West has always had dry summers and fire seasons. What the warming does is load the dice. It makes the hot events hotter, the dry spells drier, and the fire seasons longer and more intense. It shifts the odds and the extremes, rather than inventing the phenomenon. The people whose job is to study this were direct about where things are heading. Experts quoted during the event described extreme heat on the 4th of July becoming the new normal, and they pointed to the drying of the West as a trend that raises the fire danger year over year. One scientist made the point almost wryly, noting that the founding generation, adopting the Declaration of Independence in July, could not have foreseen people setting off fireworks across an arid, drought-stricken West on that same date centuries later. The observation lands because it captures how the ground beneath a familiar tradition has shifted. There is a specific finding worth restating because it ties the climate picture directly to what this event did. The study of Western fires found that nearly half the area burned over more than 2 decades happened during or right after a heat wave, and that fires grew more than 50% faster on heat wave days. As heat waves become more frequent and more intense in a warming climate, that relationship suggests the fire seasons will grow with them. The link between heat and fire is not just a feature of this one summer, it is a thread running into the future. None of this needs to be delivered as alarm, and it is more useful without it. The value of understanding the pattern is practical. It tells communities where to invest, in cooling centres and grid capacity for the heat, in fuel management and firefighting resources for the fires, in warning systems for the floods. It tells individuals that the plain precautions, the hydration and the shade, the fireworks care, the turning around at flooded roads, are not one-time responses to an unusual year, but steady habits for a changing pattern. Knowing the trend is what lets people meet it calmly. So the force behind this event was a layering of causes. A specific weather pattern, the heat dome steered by the jet stream, arriving in a specific season loaded by a strong El Niño, over a landscape shaped by a longer-term drying trend. Each layer added to the others. Pull them apart and each is understandable on its own. Put them together and you get the event this report has followed: the heat, the fire, the smoke, and the coming floods, all flowing from one pattern in a warming world. That leaves the practical question that matters most to anyone living under this pattern right now. Where does the dome go from here, and what should people watch for as it moves? To close, it helps to return to the event itself, to what is known, what is still uncertain, and what comes next. So where does the dome stand now, and what comes next? Return to the shape of the whole event. A heat dome settled over the eastern two-thirds of the country in late June, baking more than 200 million people, breaking records from New York to the New Jersey shore, straining the power grid and the rail lines, and taking about 40 lives before storms broke it apart in early July. Then, steered by a shift in the jet stream, the same pattern rebuilt over the west, where it met a landscape dried by drought and already on fire, and turned a heat event into a fire event as well. That much is known and confirmed. The records, the deaths, the fires already burning, the grid strain, the shift from east to west, all of it is measured and documented. The heat in the west, pushing toward 118 degrees in the hottest corners and spreading well up into the interior, is real and happening now. The fires in Utah, at the Grand Canyon, and in Colorado are burning on cured ground, and the extreme heat is making them harder to fight, and the surrounding land readier to burn. What is still uncertain is the timing of what comes next. Forecasters expected the dome to shift again as the days went on, pivoting toward the northern Rockies and the Plain States, carrying the extreme heat with it as it moved. They also expected the North American monsoon to become active toward the middle of the month, drawing moisture north and eventually bringing rain to the southwest. But the exact timing of that transition, and how the pattern evolves after it, came with real uncertainty. The models agreed on the broad shape and grew less certain on the details. So the next thing to watch is the transition itself, and its stages are now clear. First, whether the dome shifts north as expected, and where the extreme heat lands as it does. Then the arrival of the early monsoon storms, which bring the dry lightning and the dust before they bring the rain, raising the fire danger in the near term. And finally, the deepening of the monsoon into heavier rain, which will ease the fires but bring the flash flood and debris flow risk in the burned and drought-hardened country. Each stage carries its own hazard, and each is worth following as it comes. For anyone living under this pattern, the practical guidance holds steady through all of it. In the heat, hydrate ahead of your thirst, stay out of the worst afternoon sun, use air conditioning or a cooling centre, and check on the people around you who may be struggling. Where fireworks and open flame are restricted, respect the restriction, because the land is primed to burn. When smoke or dust fills the air, stay inside with the windows closed if you can. And when the rain comes, move to higher ground early and never drive into water across a road. Simple habits, all of them, and together they are what carry a person and a community through safely. The larger lesson of this event is not a frightening one, it is a steadying one. A heat dome is among the most predictable of nature's dangers. It sends its signals days ahead, it builds slowly enough that preparation can meet it, and its hazards, the heat, the fire, the smoke, the flood, are all survivable when people understand them and look out for one another. This event tested the country's systems and its people, and while it exacted a real cost, most of what held was the result of warning, preparation, and care. Follow the dome as it moves north and the monsoon as it stirs. Watch the official forecast for the timing where you are, because that is where the specifics live, and keep the plain precautions close, not out of fear, but out of the same steady readiness that carried so many through the weeks behind us. The pattern will run its course, as these patterns do. The task in the meantime is simply to stay informed, stay cool, and stay in touch with the people nearby. This report will keep following the event as it develops,